Hello, everyone. Welcome back at Candid Craic by EQ Lab. Today we have Soundari. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you. Lovely to be here with the two of you.
Thanks for joining. Richard, how are you today?
I'm good, Oscar. It's been a very busy day, so I hope I can keep up with Soundari today during this one. We'll see.
I'll find out soon. Soundari, before we start, I'll typically start with the question of explain a little bit more about yourself.
Yeah, and before I start that, just want to thank both of you, Richard and Oscar, for creating such a wonderful learning community. I remember when DD first started early 2020. I joined the first session thinking, okay, what is all this about? Drinking dialogues and here we are today, enjoying the conversations, enjoying the connections that you've created and the collaboration. So you've really managed to bridge the digital distance, and all of us are richer for it. So thank you. I can't say it enough. I do manage to comment occasionally on the chats, but thank you.
Very much.
Yeah, you're too kind, Soundari, but thank you.
No, it's really heartwarming. So run a leadership consultancy centering around business storytelling. We work on change and transformation initiatives, future focused skills. And I think having worked for over 25 years in Hong Kong, in the Middle East, in India, and with organizations like Levers and ANZ, and now with my own firm, I think some of the insider challenges and the insider view into organizations and what teams face is what drives my passion. Like when I worked with ANZ and before that with Unilever, we used to have great training sessions, and it was called training then. But you'd come back to work and it was like BAU. So something that was always, bothering us is how do we make this relevant? How do we get the practice right there, the application, so it's contextual? And the other part, which, are all our ability to connect the dots across disciplines, to zoom in and zoom out and all that, which is of course now taken a whole new meaning on Zoom. I also realized that it is all about people. The domain expertise is important. Organizations are centered around various domains and structures, but it's all about people. And especially in Hong Kong, when we were talking to clients, we keep hearing things like, our leaders are not connecting. Our sales folks are as if they're reading out of flyers. The strategy is not clear. Teams don't know what they're doing. Teams are not inspired. So we really help leaders and teams to harness the power of stories in a business context so that they can connect, they can engage, inspire, and influence. And this is our BHAG, the big, hairy, audacious goal, that will bring more humanity into the workplace. No jargons.
Before we jump into the leadership that you were talking about, I want to take a one step back. How did you get to what you do today?
Yeah, I think that's the part where I was, also talking about when I was working in, especially in branches with ANZ. Over a period of time, it's not the investment banking, it's not the personal loan products, it's not all that which is driving the organization. It's people and teams. So clearly, I wanted to be more in that space and not get siloed into just the financial and the functional expertise. I really wanted to work with people. And I think sometimes, as they say, what you look for calls out to you. That's how this whole role came calling. And as I went into consulting, we realized that this is a space that sees maximum value in creating that human space in an organization.
So you basically you're crafting out a position here where you're saying, so there's something has gone wrong in terms of siloing between organizations and the gap between leaders and the work being done, and this is the position, and you're crafting out a position in this in-between space. It's around narrative and storytelling. So can you sort of explain what you do in terms of narrative and storytelling to close this gap?
Yes. So just for example, we talk to organizations and they say, oh yeah, we have values. We believe in our values. And the values is all talk. It's hung in the wall, like, like a talisman to a ward of evil spirits kind of a thing. It's something which is there, but that's not brought to life. It's words. So a lot of the times the conversation is very abstract. So then we talk to sales teams and say, okay, how can we help you? What is it? And the sales leaders are saying, oh, our salespeople are excellent in their technical skills, but in front of the prospects, they are just reading out of brochures. They don't make sense. So we worked on, how do you really connect the conversations and the narrative to people? And stories are a best way to engage with people. You can talk in facts and figures, and that goes to the head, whereas stories go to the heart and lead to that engagement, connection, and hence action.
Mhm.
And we all make sense of the world through stories. And, with the complexity of messaging, I was looking at some acronyms last year when the Oxford Dictionary thing came up. It was the words of an unprecedented year report. One of the words which has come out is CZO. So you have all these acronyms, Chief Zoom Officer. You have all these acronyms and things coming out. We have attention deficit. We struggle, Oscar, you mentioned about switching off notifications, but we all struggle, right? The number of times we look at the phone today on everything. And if we have time, we are also choice rich. So today, if I have half an hour, I can listen to a podcast, I can watch Netflix, I can do Amazon Prime, I can do Apple TV. So how do you, as a leader, have your team and cut through all the noise? And the only way to do it is using stories. If you're using jargons, people are going to just absolutely glaze out. I was talking to this friend of mine who had gone to a town hall where the CEO was traveling around the country when they could still travel. And at the end of it, I was also gently prodding him and saying, hey, tell me, what did the CEO talk about? And he said, no, nothing. And I said, no, can't be nothing. A CEO is traveling. And he said, oh, a lot of numbers. And that also gets us thinking, right? There's a CEO, there's this whole marketing department putting their pitch deck together, getting them to talk about it. And people don't remember things. So we want to work with teams to make them more effective and not to make them as a storyteller per se. Nobody wants that as an end output, but to use it as a tool to drive business results. And so we just, work it as a tool to add to your repertoire. And it's all small incidences and anecdotes. It's not that, flashy, big Hollywood style storytelling.
So the thing that immediately stuck in my mind there was when you said values are abstract. I think it's a really important point. Values are abstract. And so one of the ways I'm beginning to think about organization, or beginning to become more explicit, I think I've been thinking this for a long time, is that we've taken and I'm going to put it in inverted commas, a scientific rigor towards culture to try and match values to people. And we're very, very, very bad at it because culture can't be understood scientifically. But when cultures first became a thing, it was about the stories of the leaders and the successes, and they were, it was ritual and myth and story, and now it's fit and compliance and values. Is that what you're doing? You're going, right, there's something more, there's an art to this, and it's about storytelling.
Yeah, and it's an art and a science, because sometimes when we say that it's an art, people automatically think it's for a select few. Some people can do it and I can't do it. So we are also trying to put structures around it to say that anybody can do it, and people are doing it. This is what we do naturally. We are storytellers somehow, but when it comes to work, we stop doing that. And you were talking about culture. So Clairol, the company. So when Steve Sadoff took over Clairol in 91, that time the company's sales was like absolutely on the downtrend. Sales volumes had gone down. And he said, this used to be a very creative company. And I know that there are creative people. So he said, let me go and look at all the packaging and the creative development people and ask them, why don't we do anything creative? And this guy in packaging just opened his drawer in his desk and showed where all his ideas were lying. So it was lying in the desk, and nobody was asking for it. People just kept their head down in that culture. So that sort of brought Steve to think that my role as a leader is to create an environment where this innovation and creativity comes out and it's okay to fail. Now, that is a motherhood statement. You still need to walk the talk on that. How do you do that? So he started asking for opposing views in discussions with colleagues, because if somebody comes up with a view and somebody shuts you down, you're going to put it in your drawer and go away. Nobody's going to answer anymore. And he convinced them that speaking up was not just tolerated, but it was encouraged. And over a period of time, it takes time. That's the other thing about all these changes, right? It's not that you put it up or say it and it makes a difference. So Steve and his team really created herbal essence through that initiative and brought in an absolute golden period for Clairol. So the culture piece is very sensitive. Again, you can just get it lost in jargons, but it takes time. And sometimes we are looking for these quick wins.
I want to go back into something you said. The fear of the art of storytelling. I mean, I can't do it. I'm scientific. I mean, it doesn't make any sense to me. I'm scientific. I'm not a storyteller. I mean, surely it's the other way around. We are storytellers. We are a storytelling animal. Without stories, there is no culture. I mean, there just isn't. So there's a whole bunch of questions there. But really, how do you sort of deal with someone who goes, "Oh, stories. Oh, that's scary." I mean, how do you deal with that?
I mean, we had this in Hong Kong. So initially when we were, just having these sessions, we were also using examples like quoting Steve Jobs and Jeff Bezos, who are all amazing storytellers, irrespective of all the other context that goes on, and we used to quote their name. And we had people coming back to us and saying, all that is fine, but these are people that we can't relate to. So don't just bring in names which are just, global or something that's too big for us to understand. Aren't they local role models? Aren't they people? And we had to really rethink how we were doing this and look at, yeah, of course there are if all of us are storytellers. I mean, every incident that you talk about which leads to an insight or a conclusion is a story. That's your idea, your discovery story of how you came to be where you are, kind of thing, right? So we really had to bring it to customizing and localizing content. So once we started this video series called Handshake, and where we interviewed leaders in Hong Kong to talk about their journey, their failures, the way things work. And that definitely created that bit of relatability. So I think it's the taking that fear away and saying it's okay to do it. And it's okay to do it in high pressure situations as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really, I mean, it's mind blowing how we've created. So in 40 years of dealing with culture being sort of the dominant school of organizational thinking, we have gone to a position where people are surprised at the power of story. I mean, it's genuinely mind blowing. It's like, well, what do you think cultures are? A collection of stories that have meaning for people. And so I just wonder, Soundari, in some of the work you've done, have you come across people following stories that are so old that they have no relevance to what's being done in the organization anymore? And if so, what do you do about that?
Mm-hmm. Good question. I haven't thought about old stories per se, but I think as long as it's relevant, like say for instance, something on a value conversation, it doesn't matter how old that story is, which showed the value in action, it is still relevant. So it is not out of place. But I think where the localization piece comes from is, if I have an icon who is like too hard to reach, I will be inspired by the icon, but I may not be able to emulate the action. So the role models have to be also somebody grounded. Then that is why I think we also need to hear failure stories in a way. And I remember reading, there's this person called Vivek Chowdhury who works with British American Tobacco. In one of his earlier organizations, Eli Lilly, he had this, people kept saying, speak up, it's good to speak up, and, it's important and all that. And it was just not working. Till the day his boss came down from a presentation that he did to the board and sat down with the team and told them, I just had a board presentation and this is what went okay, but these are the things that I missed. I missed the cues. I didn't do well. This is what happened. Till that moment, it didn't make that shift for people coming and sharing narratives or telling about their things. So again, easy to use that word, psychologically safe space, but you have to really create those moments where it happens. And Vivek talks about the fact that this particular incident really shifted and gave him the courage to open up and speak a bit more. You're not.
I want to, again, so I think you're right. I think this is really powerful stuff. Is if you've got the leader vulnerable enough to stand up on stage and tell their story, there's something incredibly powerful and transformational about it. But I am still interested. So I was listening to something recently where someone was telling a story. I think it was someone in Wales was telling a story of how the English had treated the village that they lived in, and how terrible it was, and blah, 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 blah. And the listener was Australian and said, oh, that's terrible. When did this happen? She said, oh, about 1200. So like 800 years ago, but they were still living the story. And there was still emotional resonance of an 800-year-old story in their relationships with the English today. And that's real power. And of course, in that kind of village, it might be impossible to create a story that transforms them into thinking a different way. But in an organization, it shouldn't be, because you've got this fluidity of membership, new people coming in, blah, 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 at rapid paces. So there should be even greater power to change things through narratives.
I mean, I just want to step back. Only when you explained and gave me the Wales story or example did I understand the context of what you said. So sometimes it's like, we hear a line and I should have deep dive and said, what makes you say that, instead of, just answering. So I think that example is powerful. But in organizations, maybe a lot of the times the knowledge is not captured. Sometimes the stories of how things are done or were done or what problem you faced and how you overcame is not necessarily discussed. And so you do lose knowledge when you're working in organizations. So you might have some department having figured out something and riding on some economy, which the other department has no clue. So unless this is taken, unless it comes as a broader project that the organization drives and somebody lits and collates all this. And there's this famous example of somebody who collected gloves, working gloves, which were made and ordered by different purchasers in the different purchasing departments, bought from different suppliers, and the whole, the pricing difference, the quality difference, everything was stark. So the same organization was getting the same item from 20 different suppliers at all ranges of prices. Till a purchasing manager came in and really did the review. And the purchasing manager, when he came in, he had a hint that something was wrong, but nobody was listening to him. So he actually got an intern to go through and collect samples of all this, tagged all the gloves to the name of the supplier and the prices, and piled them up on a boardroom table, and invited all the department heads to come and have a look. And that was the penny drop moment. So sometimes there is knowledge available and it gets, it's lost.
That's a sort of a step beyond just a story. That's creating a stage in which a story takes place, because you collect all of these gloves and you create the environment where someone comes in and suddenly you've created a story, because everyone will remember that moment. So there's almost sort of something theatrical in that.
Yeah, so there's story triggering, which is by your actions, you're actually triggering a story, and that gets told. Now, if he had just made a report, Excel sheet of supplier names and prices and departments and just circulated to everybody, people may not have remembered. The impact wasn't there. It had to, you're doing still a push there. And that's where the stories are a pull. You're drawing them to make their own conclusions and arrive at outcomes from that.
I tell you, my reaction to a spreadsheet like that would be, I wouldn't read it. I don't know about you, Oscar. It's like,
few years ago, actually, I was working on a storytelling project, and one thing that struck me is not that I think a lot of people when they listen to stories or they associate it with verbal storytelling, right? So and what I'm interested in as well as Sundari is a kind of the spectrum of storytelling that you address, because when you talk about storytelling, so I'm quite familiar in the startup environment. You have right in invest, and storytelling is the way you present, not verbally presented, but actually visually presented, is really really relevant. No, whether that's making sense or not.
Yeah, yeah,
Or just like through colors, or
yeah.
audio only, or body movements.
Mm,
No, like dance.
mm.
Um, so, uh, are you focusing on, if you focus, are the particular areas that you focus on in terms of storytelling within organizations? How you express that?
Right, right. We focus on storytelling, the verbal side of it for sure, because I think that's a powerful way to communicate. So leaders are talking to people. Again, to Richard's point on sending a memo, it works for Amazon to send a 6-page memo and all of you sit down and read, but you still need to discuss it. It's verbal. The conversation, the decision, and the part of it is very verbal. So we focus on the telling side, but we also focus on the story listening side. Again, to the point of how do you retain some of this knowledge that's happening in the organization? How do you collect it and put it together? So we create story circles within organizations for helping teams to discuss it. So that's the story listening piece. And then we talked also about the story triggering piece, where somebody does something. It could be a leader, it could be a team member, anybody does something that it gets talked about, and that story carries over in the organization and creates an organic shift. So pitching is a form of course, a form of storytelling as well. While whether it's created in the deck in the narrative fashion or not, it's still, as a person who's the founder, you're still telling your founder's story. And the founder's story is what sells the business, right? Why do you do what you do? Part of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think Oscar's a far better storyteller than me, and it's I rely on him for it because he makes everything simple and engaging, whereas I get complex and too analytical, I think. I'm interested here in the so there's a Japanese film called Rashomon. I don't know if you know it. Yeah, so where you've got the central story being told by 4 different characters, and the different and in different interpretations they have. And I think this is a really useful way to look at it, because all of those interpretations are partial and valid. So is that the kind of experience you're trying to create, where you talked about, well, here's the sort of silent meeting 6-page Amazon memo of a narrative, and then they've all read it, and when they're discussing it, you're trying to bring in those 6 or 7 different interpretive angles before the decision making. Is that framing what you do?
On the story circles piece, it is all discussion oriented, and it is problem or topic related. Just for example, if we want to bring in a team to talk about the diversity and inclusion initiatives that are happening and what's working and what's not, you can create data about it. The data is already there. But what the story circle does is for you to look at examples where some of it has been validated or not. So really bringing in the real life examples there into action to see, okay, this is where the data is showing, but what is it happening on ground in action? So you're actually matching the action to the trend. So it's not a sort of a vendetta against data. Data is extremely useful. And like Brené Brown says, stories are datas with a soul. So you're really putting in that soul work into it so that we can validate the data in as to what's happening on ground. Is it exactly what is happening on ground? And totally, I mean, we talked about radical candor. I'm just bringing that in just for the dimension that, so in the book, Kim talks about her run-in with Sheryl Sandberg, and we can talk about it later, but that itself is open to interpretation. It is her version of how she took it, right? And for somebody who's reading it as a narrative and saying, oh, I wouldn't have taken it like that, I might have reacted in a different way. But if you bring that story in, it is giving you something to talk about. Vis-a-vis bringing in just the data, then there is nothing to talk about. There's nothing to debate. And it doesn't lead to action. It leads to a conclusion. So
I want to go into radical candor, but I think there's one little thing I want to explore in terms of data without a soul, at least. So there's a wonderful book, I can't remember the author, David somebody, Halberstram, I think, called The Reckoning, which talks about the decline of Ford, so sort of the double decline of Ford in the States. And the second decline, so in the 70s, 60s and 70s, and he talks about you could only get a decision made if you could frame arguments in the language of the finance people, which just meant all of the operators and the innovators were just eliminated from any decision making. And I think that's the big risk with big data today, that if you can't analyze data at the level of numbers, then you're not involved in the story. I mean, would you agree? And if so, what should we do about it?
Everything is for an audience, right? Even online, we're always talking about audience before content. So you need to connect with an audience before you can talk about any of your content. And there is a bit of definitely different strokes for different folks, who's responding to what, being cognizant of it. And I think especially on the finance and the CEO piece, that's where the time that you take to tell the story becomes very crucial. It cannot be the 5-minute conversation or 10-minute conversation that you'd have at a bar with a friend or with somebody who's your team member who's more willing to listen to you. I think the messaging has to be very crisp and very clear. So you bring the data in, but you bring your narrative in to ensure that it's very crisp. And that's where the connection happens. And I think it's also a function of the rapport that you've built before you get into any action. It is the connection that you're building. If the connection is not there, then it's very difficult to even open a conversation. And stories help you build that connection, that commonality that you find with each other in some way or the other, something to do with the background, Zoom background in this case, or whatever. That builds the connection first. So you need that narrative, that connection, before you jump into asking somebody to take an action.
So, and this cycles us back to the role that culture played, because culture was seen as the glue that would stick these American organizations back together. And what actually was created was a story of American success around the notion of culture. So something like In Search of Excellence with Tom Peters was this wonderful story, and it's a wonderful story, the book, of what American successful organizations looks like. And it's the story of culture that stuck the organizations back together and gave people confidence. And really, it's story, not values. That the value, we don't, they're just too, as you said earlier, they're too abstract. It's the stories that we cling to.
Bring it to life. Absolutely. And
so
I think that cultural, sorry, yeah.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that the cultural context is important. What worked as in an American culture or Indian or Australian or whatever is different from maybe Hong Kong culture in, say, how things work. But at the essence of it, it's still stories. I mean, every culture is rich with stories, which are there in our DNA. We suppress it, we push it down, maybe because we think this is the face that has to be there, right? So to go beyond that.
So I want to move into radical candor, but Oscar, if you have any other question about story, please jump in now.
Well, I'm definitely not an expert right here in storytelling, but so one observations and one I'm very curious about, I don't know if you have a response on that, Soundari, is that it seems, so I've worked in big sports companies, and a European one and American one. And you can really see the difference how they tell stories and also the power. But this is mostly advertising, right? It's not vocalizing it.
Right.
I've always wondered why that is. Is it just because we are more used to American movies? No, we so embedded by stories from the US, and therefore it's so easy to understand versus stories from, let's say, Germany.
Mm-hmm.
I just don't, yeah, I wonder if maybe there is no correlation, but I've always feel that the Americans they really seem to nail that storytelling better than um, other people. But of course, there's a big generalization. But they seem to really be able to tap into our emotion um,
I think
better.
Mad Men and all that series on advertising and everything else as well, right?
But I don't know if it's a perpetual cycle because we watch a lot of US movie stories, and therefore we get used to it, and therefore we understand it better.
No, I think every culture does it for sure. Like we have an iconic brand in India called Amul, which is a butter brand. And everything is about stories which are contextual, which are just happening then and there. Their whole advertising piece is around that. Having said that, they're not very strong on tracking. They're not the vanity metrics people. It's a cooperative movement which runs the brand, and they don't track how many likes and hits and all that. And the CEO was giving an interview, during COVID times, everybody queuing up and stocking up on milk and butter and all that. And his wife was also getting panicky that we need to stock up. It's not just the toilet rolls, everything else is running out, kind of thing. So he queued up in his own Amul stand, a kiosk which was selling. He queued up and he brought it home. And he said, then I was thinking, why am I not trusting my own organization? I'm working on supply chain. I'm going to ensure that everybody gets their milk and butter and everything else, all the basic part. But here am I, panic driving myself to go and stand in the queue and get it for my house. And the fact that he shared it in an interview, talking about it, made a difference to say that, yes, when push comes to shove, we do what we do. But as an organization, what are the steps I'm taking to ensure the supply chain is managed so people get, and milk is essential product, essential commodity, people get what they want. And some of these conversations, obviously, sometimes it's highlighted in the media or not, but these stories are there everywhere. It's for us. And I think that's the challenge, to pick up and collect these stories and share and use them and bring them to life.
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, I do want to move the interview into the other thing you wanted to talk about, which is radical candor. Now, obviously, Oscar and I are a fan of candor because we call our podcast Candid Craic, and sort of this enjoyable candor. So can you explain what radical candor is and how you how you use it in your work?
Yeah. With all the issues that we are seeing every day, courageous conversations are difficult. Effective confrontation is even more difficult. We don't know the words, we don't know the language, we don't know how to do it necessarily. And we were working with a group of ethnic minority students in universities in Hong Kong, and they're facing on and off severe racial discrimination at the universities, and some of them as they go into their workplace. And the conversation keeps coming back to, how do you develop a voice? How do you confront in a way that leads to action? Are you going to be a bystander? Are you going to be an upstander? And what does it mean in terms of, what is the downside for you, right? There's a downside when you do some of these things. And not having that voice, having that kind of lack of trust is very disengaging for everybody. And definitely we found it, of course, with this group, which is grappling with themselves. So, which takes me to, a whole radical candor piece. Kim Scott calls it compassionate candor, though she initially named the book Radical Candor. And the whole idea is around, how do you challenge directly while clearly caring personally and deeply, so that you're giving the guidance and the feedback that is kind, it's clear, it's specific, and it's sincere. And so compassionate candor, again, a word, easier said than done, right? And she's got those 4 quadrants where she talks about, obnoxious aggression on the bottom end, and manipulative insincerity, and then moving to ruinous empathy, and then the peace, ideal spot or whatever on compassionate candor. And I think what I want to state directly is that this is not a personality test. It's not to box ourselves into this. And I'm sure if we reflect on our work life and personal life, we'll find ourselves occasionally moving across all these quadrants. So it's not a boxing exercise. It's not to put labels to people's name and put them in these things. It's creating that awareness of where you tend to be in a certain situation, or getting feedback. Hey, that was that. And, you were just absolutely obnoxious. Now it's like, and the simplest way of saying is that if you have spinach stuck in your teeth, do you whisper to the person saying, hey, Richard, you have spinach stuck in your teeth, and you help them solve it out? Do you shout out loud so everybody gets to know? Do you not say it because you're worried about your feelings? Or do you not say it because you're worried about their feelings? And that's a very simplistic way. Obviously, it's a very low context example. Spinach or teeth doesn't matter, what the hell, kind of thing. But it is, when you take it into workplace, how does this calling out work? And I mean, both of you might have obviously read the book and have this thing, but if I can quickly share it for the audience, she talks about her experience with Sheryl Sandberg. So Kim had just joined Google, and with a colleague, she was going to make a presentation to the CEO on the team about AdSense. And she had just come out of closing down a software company where she thought it was a bullshit-free zone and all that. But she had to close it down for various reasons. So she felt very energized being in Google. The AdSense business was doing great. And she goes into the room, and there is Sergey Brin and Eric Schmidt, and they're like just talking about it. And she shares the numbers, and Eric almost falls off the chair listening. Wow, okay. And he says, what resources do you want? How can we help you? And all that. So Kim thinks the meeting went off well. And Sheryl says, why don't you walk back with me to my room? And Kim is thinking, okay, this is my victory lap. I'm going to have some good feedback. So Sheryl shares 4 or 5 things that went well, how impressed she was that, the business was doing well, and how Kim has contributed. And she said, you say a lot when you're talking. And Kim just brushed it off. Oh, that's it. That's all she wanted to say. It's nothing. And Sheryl carries on and says, is it because you're nervous? Is that why you're saying a lot? And would it help if Google paid for a speaking coach for you? And Kim just brushes it off and says, I'm really busy. This is not the most important thing for me. So Sheryl stops her and says, I see what you're doing with that brush of your hand. So I can see that I have to be very direct. When you say a lot, it makes you sound stupid. And I don't know how I would have taken it if somebody had told me that. But it is hard hitting. And you think, I've done this AdSense business. It's such a great thing. Why is this important? But Kim didn't mind it. And she said, took it as an opportunity to correct something. So it's actually not how the speaker says, it's how it falls to a listener's ear. So Kim was okay with it. And I think this could be a good example of, taking it and discussing how it will fall on other people's ears. And at a workplace, whether it is a hierarchical thing, because Sheryl was obviously her boss and saying it, which makes it easier to hear it, or it is who's delivering it. Is there a relationship quotient already on? And Kim had that relationship with Sheryl. I mean, Sheryl had really helped her settle down when she had moved towns and all that. So that relationship was there. So we are okay to hear it from some people. We are okay to hear it in some context. But the candor doesn't sit well. May not be always compassionate.
So there's 2 things here. I'll first of all go with, I think what radical candor is all about, compassionate candor. It's to have sort of important conversations about difficult things. So I call it difficult conversations without destructive impact. So, we have to have a difficult, I think that's incredibly important. It's a difficult conversation without destructive impact. And I think there's a huge number of contemporary theories that talk about how do we do that. So psychological safety would be another one. How do we have these difficult conversations without destructive impact? My problem with the Sheryl Sandberg story is, and this goes back in, I've only just thought of when I was in Toastmasters. So I was president of Toastmasters Club a long time ago, and Toastmasters counts your ums and your ers when you speak. And I always found that if you had a speech without any ums and ers, you sounded fake, totally and utterly inauthentic. This is rehearsed, this is practice, this is not something I believe in. So I'm immediately looking at, so Sheryl Sandberg says, you sound stupid. And I'll say, well, depending on how many they are, you actually sound authentic. And I've just done an So the question then is, who's right? And just because it's her boss that says it, is it actually good advice?
Totally with you. And that's why I want to bring in the fact that it's to the listener's ears. Kim found it useful, and that's why she still keeps narrating about it. And it was useful for her. She went for a speech coach. She feels she's reduced the number of ums, which was important to her. She did it, whatever. I may not have done it. I may not have bothered about it. If somebody says, dress up better, wear more makeup or something like that, and they'll be useful in a podcast, I may not do it at all. I don't think it's important. So again, it's your level of where you think authenticity lies and who is saying it and how you're receiving it, whether you want to receive it or not. So it's still the onus. So Kim thought it was useful. It worked for her. It's not necessarily a replicable situation because there's so much of context around the whole thing as well, right? She had that relationship going with Sheryl. She had that, there was hierarchy. I'm not sure how much of each played into it, but it does. I mean, I think you're right. It's like absolutely not something which could have gone, it could have been obnoxious or it could have been, okay to hear.
And the personal care was the other 4 or 5 things that this was great and you're wonderful and we love you, plus there's the stuff you've done to help us settle down. So that you've got, and I think Erin Meyer calls it sandwich feedback. So can you explain that as well? Because I know that's something you work with.
Yeah. No, I think it's a very cultural thing. I want to say it's American, so you can correct me if I'm wrong. The whole feedback sandwich piece of saying, one nice thing or saying 2-3 nice things before you actually come to saying the one thing that needs to be corrected. And Erin Meyer talks about it, especially in a cultural context. And this is where the radical or compassionate candor need not work across cultures. It's empathy plus action, yes, but you may not read it as that. So she talks about a French executive who was working in the US. And again, high context, low context environments, very different. And she was coaching both the CEO and the executive who was working there. And the French executive who was working there had a feedback session. And after the performance review session, Erin had a chat with, her name was Sabine. Erin had a chat with Sabine, and Sabine said, oh, it went off really well. I'm loving this place. I always wanted to work in the US and this is working out really well. My colleagues are fantastic. And, she said that. So Erin thinks, oh, great. So this move has worked out well. And, the cross-cultural piece has been taken care of. And she goes and talks to the boss. And the boss says, yeah, she's doing well. She's settled down well. She's working with her team. But it's sort of medium. She's highly energetic and all that. But there are several critical things that she's missing out. She's making too many mistakes in her spreadsheets, and we really don't like how it's going. And we can't tell her. I spoke to her about this on Thursday, but there is no visible effort to correct. Wow. So Erin is thinking that is like somebody is very happy from a performance review, same performance review, and somebody says there's something for action. Now, that's where the cultural context comes in, because for Weber, who was giving the feedback, it was saying those 3 nice things and then talking about that one area of improvement. So he had highlighted the nice things and downplayed the area of improvement. And in the French culture, apparently, they highlight the areas of improvement and sort of, mull over the positives. But because she had heard so much of that positives, this one just fell flat. So you can be candorous or, in the conversation, but you need to probably the, before the performance review, one of the things that could have been said is Weber could have gone and said, when I give a performance review, I always start off by going through these 3 things that you've done well. Then I will also be talking about the really important part of the meeting, which is where we need to look at improvement.
This is where the Sandberg story can be reinterpreted. So the Sandberg story could be, she has heard people talk about others who've given presentations who and a lot, and have heard the critical feedback. Oh, this person's not worth listening to. So she hears that within the context of the culture. And so it's no longer just one person's perspective. It's actually it's drawing from other information and data to use that to say, this is where you need to change. And all of a sudden, then it becomes far more useful than just one person's perspective. It's no longer a biased, this is what I think, but it's something that will work within the context of that organization, which then becomes incredibly helpful. So I can see from that perspective, it's incredibly useful. So, is that how you would interpret the Sandberg story? Or do you think that's how
I love the way you interpreted it. So I'm also thinking it's great context setting, right? Because any person giving feedback, while we want to assume that the feedback is just for this person and one-on-one, it is a function of a lot of the past things that have happened. And Cheryl had caught that in Google, this is how things worked. And when people did that, this is what worked. But I think one point that also adds on to it is that she didn't say, you are stupid, which again is a nuance if you want to nitpick and wordsmith kind of a thing. She said, you sound stupid, and just comes across like that. And again, you're so right, because both of them were from the same culture. They caught on to it in the same way, in the same wavelength, and the antennas were linked. Whereas it might have been a different bandwidth when it's a cross-cultural conversation. So I want
to give an Astoria that's cross-cultural. So a good friend of mine in Hong Kong, and I'll try and hide all the details, but was doing some work for an American company, and was having to have meetings with the American company at 10 o'clock every Monday night. And these meetings were run in a sort of a directly challenge, personally care way. But the direct challenge was a real rip apart of the work being done locally, largely because the Americans didn't understand the cultural conditions in which the work was being done. So they, all of the work, you look at it in the Hong Kong perspective, and incredible work was being done. But from the American perspective, it wasn't happening quickly enough, and it's too complex, and there was this, and there was a relation, what are you doing? So there was this real direct challenge, followed by 45 minutes of it, maybe followed by 5 minutes of personal care at the end. We do love you, and you're doing a great job, and we like this, and we like that, and we like the other. And of course, at 10 o'clock at night, the cortisol of 45 minutes of having your work torn apart, shredded, meant that you could never sleep. And then the next day was almost a write-off, because there was, so that was it done badly in a cross-cultural context. So that's one challenge. The other one would be power asymmetry. It's where someone in a position of power doesn't care about the cultural context. They just go, this is my perspective, and I don't, from my perspective, the feedback looks like this. So how would you deal with, because they're both incredibly biased. Well, one is incredibly biased, and one is I'm critiquing from a position of not understanding. So how would you deal with that kind of stuff?
I think bosses who are both obnoxious and also ruinously empathetic both can destroy in different ways. And I think I've been guilty of being ruinously empathetic in my earlier life. I had somebody in the team who was clearly not interested in that role, but who had applied from university, got into the role, was put into it. And I didn't bother to check on that person. The person was working in my team, and I just let it fritter. And what I just said is, oh, they will settle down, they'll do it, it'll take its toll, and it'll all work out. So neither did I give feedback, nor did I ask the person what their comfort space was. So this went on, and what it actually led to was the team taking on the additional load. I was doubling up to, ensure things happen, and we were all covering up. And this didn't help the person for sure. The person finally quit and went. And, in the exit interview is when I said, maybe there is something. And, I was using those words. I was using maybe there is something, and I was still very hesitant. And that really didn't help. The person could have had that feedback earlier. We had the relationship, and the person could have just gone on to do what they love to do or what they are doing now. So I think that's the ruinous empathy part, where it's empathy without any action. It's overdose of compassion and all that, but it's not leading to anything. And on the boss, which is obnoxious, I think, bully bosses take a lot of physical and mental toll. Like you said, they weren't able to function the next day, right? Confrontation has its own issues. So there is a conversational confrontation that you can have. It has career repercussions. It has compensation repercussions. You're really not in a great space. I think where possible, looking at exploring some exit options is really something, and maybe definitely having some bit of mentorship conversations.
So I'd just like to turn this back into your storytelling stuff, because potentially, and I don't know whether this is the case, but potentially the person suffering the power asymmetry, the lower down one, might be able to use storytelling in a way that makes the context understandable to those at the top, so that they can have a more meaningful discussion. Because that's the problem. When someone at the bottom goes, but your feedback is just irrelevant to the work I'm doing, it doesn't help, because it's so contextually separate from. Is that a possibility? Could you spin that around, and could you do help in that area? Because I think that's really important work. How do those with less power frame responses to poor feedback in a way that enables the better work to be done?
No, absolutely. I think, the book is great, but the last mile from the book to how to translate to behavior is the key piece. So taking it and working on, how do you build self-awareness? How do you know where you are as a boss or as a leader? How are you doing these things? How do you self-regulate? How do you create that kind of empathy or social awareness? How do you manage relationships? And this is all where storytelling can really be powerful, both from collecting stories from people. So when we talk about, say, even diversity and inclusion and all, collecting stories from people where they are facing the ground realities. At the same time, looking at stories from people who've crossed that path and hearing from them how they navigated that path. So building that bridge between the two, opening that conversation. And for that, you need that psychologically safe space where people can talk. And you do need that action coming in from the top, the taking action part. And, it's like the devil is in the details, right? Taking into those small things which matter. Leaders are always going to be under a microscope. So they need to be very conscious of their actions on how they are really walking the talk. And it's the small things, you can talk about, management by walking around and all that. How do you really capture the things that are happening on the ground? And I remember reading somewhere that Dick Costello, who used to be with Twitter, he used to do this walking around, and he saw this two employees fighting over dirty dishes in the micro kitchen. And normally he would have just turned his head and said, it's a problem and I'll get somebody to deal with it. But he was doing that walking around time. So he said, let me get involved. And he looks around and finds a better place to put the dirty dishes. And he says, he asked those two employees, do you think that place is better? Is it okay if we move it there? And they also look around and say, yeah, that looks better. And then he starts collecting the dirty dishes and going and putting them there. So you're actually then walking the talk on not just giving out, knowledge or information, or this is how it is done, this is how we do it, but actually getting hands in and doing it. So for any of this aggression, and I mean, we are all talking about, sexual harassment and all kinds of things happening all around the world. For any of this, really getting into that conversation and getting into discussion to say how somebody managed the process, it's great to know. It gives you an idea of how you could do it. So that's where also the story conversations, the story circles can come in really handy.
Before I throw in the last question, Oscar, have you got anything more you wish to ask?
Well, I was thinking, right, it's like the cultural context speaks to me because I guess for the listeners and the viewers, I was raised in Holland, so there's this radical candor, and they are known for being straightforward. And I've seen examples where it can be very helpful, and I've seen examples where it's the opposite. And yeah, I mean, we could talk about this probably for another hour, because I've seen within organizations, it's such a complex contextual challenge, right? Storytelling, what is a good and bad story, and what is a great example when you bring something up. So yeah, it really resonates with me, especially that radical candor. Just look at what is radical in the first place, because if you would ask someone from Holland or someone from or someone in Hong Kong, you probably get very different answers. But so I'm not going to jump into that too deep today, so because we need to wrap it up. So I'll let Richard, I'll let you wrap it up.
Well, the last question, as always, is the $9 trillion question. So we argue that there's $9 trillion worth of lost value creation because of outdated and insufficient ways of doing things. And with you, the question would be, so if storytelling and radical candor become central parts of organizational life, where and how is that lost value going to get recreated?
I think we need to look at how we influence and trigger action. And like I said, I remember my daughter's pediatrician telling me, once told me when my daughter was a baby, that I keep looking at her under a microscope and keep telling, oh, this is wrong and that is wrong and this is there, this daughter's come and what can you do and all that. And he said, just leave her be. Don't look at things under a microscope. But today, in the context, every action that everybody does is under a microscope, and especially in leaders and teams. And I remember John Flint, and I love quoting him. Before he left, he created this thing called Healthy as Human Systems in HSBC. And he talked about that in all my life, I created about 12 million slides, PowerPoint slides, and nobody remembers a single word of what I said. But I shared my stories, my personal stories of highs and lows and what went right and what went wrong, what was successful and what failed. And people still remember those and are learning from that. And I think that's the power of stories. You leave a legacy which is larger than yourself, beyond yourself. And it's not just your legacy, it's the organization's power to grow with it.
Right. Thank you, Soundari.
Thank you so much.